Hello, everybody. I'm Tim Young, curator of modern books and manuscripts at Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, and joining me is...
I'm Dr. Pádraic Whyte, and I'm the director of the Master's Program in Children's Literature at the School of English in Trinity College in Dublin.
And we're going to be talking about Children's Lit 101. This first episode is about revisiting bestsellers of the past. Pádraic?
Yeah, so one of the things about today's podcast is that we're going to have a look at texts that were bestsellers back in the day, but that many of you may not have heard of. So I'd like to begin by talking about an Irish author called L.T. Mead, who's been referred to as the J.K. Rowling of her day, but most people probably haven't heard of her. So L.T. Mead was this prolific publisher, author. She published about 280 novels in her time, which makes her one of the top authors in terms of output in Ireland ever. And you know how much we like to write in Ireland, so that is saying something. But she was born in Cork in 1844, and later in life, she was in her early 30s, she moved to London, and she set up a girls' magazine called Atalanta, and she was editor of that magazine. But she had this prolific career then, where she published all these girls' stories, particularly school stories for girls. And this is happening in the middle of massive changes in the education system in England at the time, in Britain at the time. So there's the 1878 Act, so more girls are going to schools for the first time. And her writing is kind of as a result of that. It's all tied up together. So she wrote some amazing books, the school stories, and authors like Enid Blyton and J.K. Rowling used the same tropes that Mead was using back in the 19th century. But one of my favorite books of L.T. Mead, I'm going to bring an image up on the laptop, on my iPad here, is called Light of the Morning. And it's the story of an Irish girl. And this novel follows a familiar pattern in Mead's work, in that it's about a young Irish girl who's kind of wild. She's out on the landscapes and she's sent to boarding school in England to tame her. And the word tame is used over and over again. And this is a common trope throughout Mead's work. So what's interesting about this one is that it's all caught up in Irish and British politics of the period, the land wars and so on. This girl is so passionate. Nora is the name of the protagonist, and she's staying with her English cousins and she's going to their schools and they can't believe how unruly she is the whole time. But they're also envious of her passion and her freedom and her wildness. And they're really set up in contrast to this as kind of tame and quite conservative all the time. But there's this one brilliant moment where Nora is this fantastic piano player and she plays with such passion that the school teacher is reduced to tears for it. And it's obviously this passion, this wildness is something to be valued. But at the same time, we notice that she's taught how to play classical piano eventually. And this wildness, this freedom, this passion is ultimately curbed. And throughout the whole text, it's about looking at this tension between freedom and constraint, I suppose, and the importance of civilizing to a certain extent, but the importance of retaining that passion within us at the same time. So, Tim, you also have some books and some authors that you'd like to talk about, but you're going to talk from the 20th century, is that right?
Yes, so I'm going to talk about the U.S. perspective of 20th century children's literature. There's a longer story, which is really fascinating, as we know, about the growth of the children's market, about how books were actually sort of crafted to be aimed at certain audiences. And there's this really interesting story in the 20s and 30s about sort of the struggle over what books were good for kids. Was fantasy and imaginative and idealized forms, or were sort of more realistic stories? And so that's something we can talk about another time. But I just want to start with something I was very intrigued by. I'm going to do a little split screen or green screen here. Here we go. So Publishers Weekly, which tracks publishing data and trends in the United States, in 2001 did a survey of publishers to ask them to give them numbers for a list of the best-selling children's books of the 20th century in the US. And this, if you can see, is the top 10. And there are names that we know. There's Dr. Seuss, he's in there twice, for Green Eggs and Ham, and for, which other one? The Cat in the Hat, of course, number 9. And Harry Potter, of course, is there at number 10. I'm sure that actually has gone up a bit. But if you look here, first of all, the number 1 bestseller is The Pokey Little Puppy, a book that we know, but we might not know the name Janet Sebring Lowry, who wrote it. But then if you go down here, number 3 is Tootle by Gertrude Crampton. And then number 8 is Scruffy the Tugboat by Gertrude Crampton. And if you look, that book, her other book, The Pokey Little Puppy, and 2 others, were published by Golden Books in the 1940s, and they all sold between 6 million and almost 10 million copies. That's a really important thing to think about. So here's A Pokey Little Puppy. It's a book that we may know, people love and are and cherish. One of the reasons it was loved and cherished, it was one of the first books that if you got it, it said, "This book belongs to." Okay, you can see that. And it gave the child who had it, this sense of ownership, and they were actually building their own library. But the thought behind this was children's books, even though they became more democratic in the 20th century, they were still a bit precious, and they were kind of expensive, and you would get them at your public library, but the ownership of children's books was actually not quite as high as for adult readers. So Simon & Schuster launched a program in 1942 called the Little Golden Books, books that were actually very compact, made of inexpensive materials. They were hardcover, but the covers were just like pressed cardboard. And in 1942, they launched it, and they were 25 cents each, and they were an amazing hit. They were basically sort of the juggernaut of children's book sales, as we can tell from the top 10 titles. And this made the books more available to middle-class libraries, and households. But the interesting thing I want to say is that the titles are more memorable than the actual authors. And I want to actually sort of reclaim somebody. So here's Tootle. This is Gertrude Crampton. She wrote about a little train that goes a little bit sort of wild. And then she followed up with another anthropomorphized form of transportation, Scruffy the Tugboat and His Adventures Down the River. These books were in print for decades, and Golden Books remained in operation until the 1980s, and then in the 1990s it was bought as a brand by Penguin Random House, and many of these books have been republished, so they actually are still widely available. But I want to actually reclaim Gertrude Crampton. There she is. It's very difficult to find information about her, but she was born in New York, and she was educated in a teacher's program in the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and then she came to New York, and she was hired by Simon & Schuster to write these books, along with a few other people, including Margaret Wise Brown, whose reputation is much more celebrated to these days, and she passed away in 1996 in Arizona. Other than that, there's not that much information, and even in Leonard Marcus's book about book publishing called The Golden Legacy, there's very little information beyond what I told you. So I would say that if there are any graduate students who are watching this, Gertrude Crampton and the other known names but under-recognized writers of Golden Books would be a fantastic piece of children's literature to reclaim.
It's interesting that you're talking about books that were really popular and still we know them. They're in the kind of cultural ether, but that a lot of young people these days aren't reading them. And a lot of people have never heard of The Outsiders, or they've never heard of Robert Cormier and The Chocolate War, which again is it's probably one of the more famous texts, certainly in the 70s and 80s. But a lot of people are reading it for the very first time at university rather than as teenagers. And I just find Cormier's work fascinating, just because he was born in 1925 in Massachusetts. He comes from a French-Canadian immigrant background, and he spent most of his life in that small town or in small towns nearby. But looking at his books, looking at The Chocolate War in particular, it is Let me see, I'll bring up an image just in case people haven't seen the cover before. So there's the Chocolate War. And it's set in a high school in contemporary America in 1974. And it revolves around this sale of chocolates to raise money in this Catholic high school. And Jerry is the main protagonist there. And Jerry decides, or is kind of pressurized into just saying, no, he's not going to sell the chocolates. And this causes chaos across the school in terms of the infrastructures that are there. Nobody's ever rebelled or been seen to rebel like that before. But things don't go so well. It's quite a dark novel. And you can probably tell that from the opening line, which is set on a football field. And the opening line is, they murdered him. And really that's the kind of tone that you get throughout the novel. But this is, Cormier deals with real life experiences, and he is concerned with moral action, immoral inaction. He's concerned with the nature of evil and how it comes about in the first place. But within this book, which is all about corruption within the school body, within the teachers and so on, he is concerned with corruption in American society and what happens when people get away with things. They do really horrible things, they do bad things, and there are no repercussions. But his point is that he's always trying to point towards the bigger picture, beyond the ending, that maybe there is hope beyond that. And he also says in his interviews that happy endings are not something that we're entitled to, but they are things that we have to work for. And he's trying to get young readers in particular to look beyond narcissism and to position themselves within this wider culture. Where do they see themselves within this? Tim.
Thanks for that, Pádraic. And we could go on and have a whole session about 1970s authors. I grew up on these novels, so I have this affection for them, but I think that they are great and we need to recognize them as the foundation for a new way of storytelling that is very, very strong these days. So we will say thank you to everybody, and hopefully we will see you again. Many of these books that we mentioned are in print, but a number of them actually might either be excerpted on authors' websites or on the Internet Archive or Project Gutenberg. So have a look, and stay safe and stay well.
Thank you.
Okay, see you next time.